you've all had a cup of tea and a cookie, otherwise we've got a lot of cookies to eat up tomorrow. Anyway, what a fantastic day so far. We've been exploring some fantastic and fascinating issues around risk and evidence and normalisation and surveillance and control of potential and actual mothers through our focus on contraception and pregnancy. But we now move to a discussion of the post-birth experience and how these themes inform our understanding of the nurturing of the newborn and how they construct ideals of good motherhood and shape the experience and responses to feeding. And we've got three fantastic panellists here. So next to me I've got Vicky and Charlotte and Fiona. And what I'd like to do is just tell you a little bit about each of them and then ask each of them to speak for about 15 minutes and then we'll take questions at the end. As Jenny said at the beginning, we do have another big lecture coming in, so we'll have to keep to time. So our first speaker is going to be Charlotte Faircloth, and she's a senior lecturer, Department of Social Sciences at the University of Roehampton, where I used to work, and she's also a visiting scholar and founding member of the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies at the University of Kent. Charlotte has explored women's experiences of attachment, parenting and full-term breastfeeding in London and Paris. And you can fully read this in her book, Militant Lactivism, Attachment, Parenting and Intensive Motherhood in the UK and France, which I'm sure is going to be informing her discussion today. Can't wait to hear about it. Vicky Fallon is based at the Department of Psychology at the University of Liverpool and has published widely on feeding babies, with her most recent article looking at the emotional and practical experiences of formula feeding mothers. But she's also examined the differences experienced by breastfeeding, formula feeding mothers, and that may come out in the discussion. But how this links to postpartum anxiety and infant feeding outcomes. And finally, Fiona Woollard is an Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Southampton, who has wide-ranging interests from normative ethics to the philosophy of sex and pregnancy. The latter includes an exploration of the rights and duties of pregnant women and body ownership. And today she's going to be looking at the significance of default in representations of feeding. So I hope you've done you all justice. And Charlotte, can we ask you to go first? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and also, as ever, to Jenny for organising such a wonderful day. My work on breastfeeding draws on the research Sarah was talking about with women in London who are members of La Leche League. And I'm just going to talk about the London research, although I did also do some in Paris. And LLL is an international breastfeeding support organisation, and I just want to give you a sort of overview of that today as a way of linking to some of our the wider discussions really that we've been having. And so in particular what I'm looking at is the accounts of a small but significant population of mothers within La Leche League who practice a form of mothering called attachment parenting, which will probably be familiar to lots of you in the room, but specifically their full-term breastfeeding, often for a period of several years. So attention to what borrowing a term from Goffman called identity work, which is the sort of narrative processes of self-making that these mothers engage in, was part of an argument that for certain arguably actually greater numbers of parents in the UK, the word parent these days has shifted from being simply a noun to describe something that you are, so a relationship with a child, to a verb. It's now something that we do, parenting. Today, the way that we raise our children is thought to be both the source of and a solution to a whole host of social problems, and this is the kind of thing that me and my colleagues in the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies have been looking at for a few years. So parenting culture can be summarised as the more or less formalised rules of conduct that have emerged over recent years, which reflect a more sort of deterministic view of parents and define expectations about how parents should raise their children. And certainly parenting these days is an occupation in which adults, and particularly mothers, I think it's fair to say, are expected to be emotionally absorbed and become personally fulfilled. And feeding, I think, is probably one of the more conspicuously moralised elements of mothering, and that's the focus today. Of course, feeding has long been central to the maternal identity, but I think it's fairly obvious that that's become particularly moralised today. There is officially, at least, a strong orthodoxy that breast is best, an injunction that affects women whether they breastfeed or not, and I think we'll probably hear more about that from Victoria in a moment. Because of its vital importance for the survival and healthy development of infants, feeding is a highly scrutinised domain, in which mothers must counter any charges of practising unusual, harmful or morally suspect techniques. Strong feelings about feeding are derived from the fact that it operates as what Kukla calls a signal issue that boxes women off into different parenting camps. So although policy today eschews the use of categories that could be accused of stigmatising mothers or overtly moralising about their behaviour, the idea that there is a moral context to infant feeding is upheld by virtually all studies of the maternal experience. And again, I think that's not just feeding, but other aspects as we talked about. So in breastfeeding to what's called full term, the women that I'm working with invite critical engagement with their accountability strategies. That is, how do they explain why they do what they do? Exploring their particular accounts offers a means of sort of reflecting on wider norms of infant feeding and care. And this shows us that whilst these women practice a form of infant feeding that is technically validated by wider policy directives, which emphasise the risks associated with formula milk, their identity work is not as straightforward as we might expect. And instead, they sort of sit at a slightly uncomfortable juncture between affirmation and marginalisation, highlighting fairly significant dissonance, if you like, between statistical norms, ideological norms, and cultural norms. So in this paper, I'm just going to do 3 things fairly quickly as a way of reflecting on these wider norms of infant feeding, and you can see them here. So, across space and time, societies have had very different ideas about children, and that in turn has shaped how adults are expected to behave towards them. So today in Britain, the argument is that childcare can be roughly divided into styles that are sort of structured and those that are more liberal. The former is characterised by practices such as scheduled feeding, separate sleeping, and arguably formula feeding. Liberal models, by contrast, take a less kind of regimented approach in favour of more relaxed styles of care, and they're often characterised by practices like long-term or on-cue breastfeeding, as in not on a schedule, a family bed or positive discipline. And of course, I'm not going to go into this here, but there is, they're not mutually exclusive, and people don't necessarily choose to do one and then are able to do it. Sometimes one ends up formula feeding despite having a kind of more liberal approach to parenting, for example. But liberal models of childcare have been made most famous in the work of William and Martha Sears, who coined the term attachment parenting in their book in 2000. That was originally published in 1992. They drew on the work done by people like Bowlby and others to argue that the optimum way of caring for a child was to keep mother and baby in prolonged physical contact. The argument is that babies have evolutionary expectations that must be met if they are to mature into happy, healthy children and adults. So arguing that modern culture has impeded common sense parenting, they say that this is what we would all do if left to our own healthy resources. So imagine you're on a desert island sort of idea. And in line with this blueprint, other typical practices amongst my informants, as I say, includes breastfeeding on cue, bed sharing, and baby wearing in a sling rather than using a pushchair, all as part of this kind of attachment parenting, a style of childcare which emphasises the real importance of long-term proximity between the child and caretaker as a means of optimising development. So these are some of the practices, the B practices, that then are said to lead to the A's and the C's. Breastfeeding makes children sort of communicative and adaptable, or whatever. So La Leche League International is the world's foremost breastfeeding support organisation, and it was founded in 1956 in the USA. This is its kind of tagline, if you like. It provides information and support for breastfeeding women all over the world through a series of local monthly meetings, via a telephone helpline and in its publications. It's the only group of its kind to have a specific philosophy behind its approach, and this is probably best summarised as mothering through breastfeeding. But you can see here one of the points of the philosophy is that ideally the breastfeeding relationship will continue until the baby outgrows the need. Now, this is really important, particularly for this room full of people. I wouldn't want you to go away thinking that all mothers in La Leche League or all women who go along to La Leche League meetings are attachment parents. They are sort of very different. But I have focused particularly on the accounts of those women who are attachment parents and the values that they promote and enact. So these accounts that I'm going to give you are not official La Leche League philosophy, but rather particular women's understandings of their own breastfeeding experiences. And so this is me attending some of the meetings in London, and this was during 2007. So again, be interested to hear sort of how things might have shifted in the last decade. And I later interviewed and conducted an email survey with around 50 women. Mothers were in the vast majority white, around 34 years old, well-educated to university level or equivalent, and married. And those that were identified as full-term breastfeeders made up just over half of my sample in the London group. Now again, I probably don't need to tell this room that the UK government advises breastfeeding should be exclusive for the first 6 months and continue for anything up to 2 years or beyond. Yet whilst a quarter of women do breastfeed for that long in conjunction with feeding their children other foods, only 2% of women are actually exclusively breastfeeding at 6 months. So this was actually at the time of research. I don't think it's changed actually a huge amount since then. Statistics don't exist for the number of women breastfeeding beyond a year, but it's clear that continued breastfeeding becomes increasingly anomalous in congruence with the time that passes. So in this case, full-term breastfeeding ranged anything from between a year and 8 years old, but was typically for sort of 3 to 4 years. So women who breastfeed after 6 months or for long periods must, just like women who do not breastfeed in the early months, undertake identity work to counter these kind of accusations of deviance. But this time it's characterised by establishing themselves as sort of non-conventional but legitimate within the social context. And so as I see it, their accounts about this being natural, as we're about to hear, are a profoundly cultural process. And so this is a fairly typical quote from one of the women that I interviewed, and it's quite a long quote for which I apologise, but it encompasses a lot of the themes that I ended up kind of developing in the work. So I say to her, can you give me 3 reasons why you wanted to breastfeed while you're still breastfeeding? She says, well, there's social reasons, health reasons, by which she means physical, emotional, psychological, and the third one, political reasons, I guess. She says, to not use what is given for free for the best possible nourishment on so many levels, it's a bit like wasting of a resource, wasting the gift. I think it's a bit arrogant towards nature. So this idea that humans have the same body as humans 400,000 years ago is for many women a way to rationalise their full-term breastfeeding. They reason that our physical makeup is primarily the same as those humans who hunted and gathered for millions of years because the time that has passed since their emergence is only a blip in an evolutionary sense. So the anthropologist Catherine Detweiler, a biological anthropologist I should say, was one of the most widely cited authors amongst some others I spoke to when I was sort of asking them about why they were still breastfeeding. And she uses kind of cross-cultural, cross-species and cross-temporal examples of lots of factors, but things like length of gestation amongst other mammals, other primates, to come to sort of human blueprint for weaning, which is free of culture. And you can see what she concludes here, somewhere between 2.5 and 7 years of age. Now, mapping this blueprint onto contemporary circumstances creates a problem. Norms of modern infant care, such as scheduled sleeping or feeding routines, are presented by the women I was working with as being massively out of sync with the evolutionary requirements of human beings. So part of the appeal of attachment mothering is that the model is imitative of infant care practices that follow an ancestral pattern. It's biologically appropriate to the human species, and so crucially, it's not just traditional, which is kind of appealing enough in some ways, but adaptive, right? So this is going to optimise, and I think that's similar to sort of the argument Sue was making earlier. Child-led weaning is natural, whereas mother-led weaning is cultural and therefore not appropriately biological. Now, in aping a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, few women actually want the lifestyle, what that lifestyle entails, where access to resources, health and mortality are obviously of concerns of very different order to most of us living in the UK. But rather, I think what we all want to do with this kind of reasoning is to cherry-pick those elements that fit with our own sensibilities. So it's one thing for a Kung mother living in the Kalahari, so one of the sort of classic examples, to breastfeed her 4-year-old where suitable weaning foods do not exist, but it's quite another for a middle-class woman living in London. And the point really is that neither of them is more natural than the other. A view of culture as something external to nature presents a very unhelpful dichotomy, I think, where human interaction with and manipulation of the environment is considered artificial. In fact, this sort of adaptation or finding best fit is what evolution has always been about. And indeed, the broad spectrum of anthropological perspectives on the issue highlight flexibility and adaptation to local circumstances as the most prominent feature of human infant care, and that includes adaptation to local cultural norms and values specific to a particular time and place. But you saw the sort of opening slide that there are other kinds of rationalisation that women would use. So when they told me that what they were doing was most natural, they didn't mean that they were just blindly following the examples of primitives or primates, as they would put it. They also knew that what they were doing was best because science tells them it is healthiest. And so the clinical evidence around the benefits of breastfeeding and continued breastfeeding in relation to the outcomes of formula-fed children were often cited. However, the limited amount of studies around long-term breastfeeding have largely been conducted in the developing world, and it makes it hard to compare with the UK context. So I'm not going to dwell on this here, but suffice to say there are numerous problems associated with this evidence, both empirical and political. I do want to make it clear, however, that there's no evidence that long-term breastfeeding and attachment parenting is at all harmful. But that said, the claims that it is beneficial require some contextualisation. So as well as this kind of political evidence around breastfeeding, there are two other sorts of science that women would refer to. First, I've already mentioned briefly the psychological evidence that is now known as attachment theory from people like Bowlby, who argued that if the mother was absent, either physically or mentally during a formative period of attachment, a child could suffer personality disorders such as anxiety or depression. But as people like Diane Ayer have argued, rather than being tied to a consistent primary attachment figure or restricted to a particular sensitive period, attachment should be considered a highly plastic phenomenon amongst human beings. And it's also important to note a sort of nominative slippage here. Attachment parenting, as a specific way of raising children, has little correlation with the attachment theory of Bowlby. So, for example, practices such as co-sleeping, breastfeeding, and baby wearing do not necessarily lead to the development of greater clinical attachments in mother-infant pairs. But the third kind of evidence that attachment parenting advocates use increasingly is neuroscientific work. And the argument with that is that from late pregnancy on through into the second year of life, the human brain undergoes a critical period of accelerated growth. And so as one advocacy magazine argues, all basic needs of the baby must be met through a relationship with a caregiver. In order to maintain emotional equilibrium, babies require a consistent and committed relationship with one caring person. And based on sort of MRI scans, it says the research indicates that the best person for that relationship is the mother. Now, I just want to think for a moment about what the political implications are of some of these accountability strategies as a way of linking with some of the other conversations we've been having today. Particularly those around what is evidence-based. In short, while science tells us a lot about the world, the meaning that we ascribe to these facts, i.e. how we should act on them, is not straightforward. The benefits of breastfeeding and attachment parenting serve as a sort of seemingly morally neutral canon about which mothers can defend their mothering choices and spread the word about appropriate parenting to other parents. But talking about science can eclipse areas of the infant-parent relationship to the extent that other calls on, let's say, a mother's time can be left in the shade. And this is particularly, perhaps particularly pertinent where science says that intensive embodied nurture carried out by the mother over a period of years is the optimal form of care. And so you can see here, this is from Frank Ferredi, who's also involved in the Centre for Parenting and Culture Studies, talking about the way in which these days it appears that science has the last word on all the important questions of our time. And so at some of the meetings I attended, it wasn't unusual to hear the mothers who would jokingly describe themselves as the militant lactivists use this kind of science to speak quite critically about mothers who did not parent their children in attachment parenting styles. Though, again, La Leche League leaders would be kind of keen to temper these overzealous converts, as they put it. This zealousness was most obviously brought home to me in the reactions to one of the papers that was made available in one of our very first conferences, actually, with the Centre quite a few years ago. And I got this email from a woman in the States who says, I'm an active member of LLL, I practice attachment parenting, I still breastfeed my 4.5-year-old daughter, and we also co-sleep, etc., etc. I was reading one of my favourite websites. And the latest topic of this website is your study. Needless to say, the cow goddess is greatly insulted by your study, and I'll show you the cartoon in a moment. It's very patronising to say the least, but I do not have the energy to engage in an argument with you over what I know in my heart and is backed up by science is doing the right thing for my child. So I clicked through to the site, and this is Hathor the cow goddess reading aloud from the paper that I've given. And so you can see here that this kind of perceived challenge to the evidence around attachment parenting was taken as a challenge to women's very conception of self. And as you will see, rather paradoxically in the cartoon, there is a final argument that women make about their mothering, one that appears a little bit later than the others, but is possibly the most powerful for these women. Say what you like about science or evolution, but actually full-term breastfeeding for me just feels right. In many senses, it's not based on thought, but on instinct or intuition. And this is a kind of reification of the body consciousness, which is so central to this philosophy. And I'll just wrap up by mentioning this. So this is a classic example from Virginia. You will know too, it's just something I feel so strongly, you'll know too when you have your own children. So if, as the American academic Vogel argues, an agent is one who is a conscious, rational subject acting in their own interests, the accounts of these mothers are quite troubling, because rather than thinking through their options as parents, they draw on insight from feelings that cannot be explained or reasoned. Theoretically, they could parent like everyone else, but at the same time as they speak of choice, they speak about being guided by gut feelings. I take a slightly more sympathetic view because I wonder whether dismissing feelings like this doesn't have the effect of invalidating maternal or any kind of experience. If one cannot argue for something simply on the basis that it feels right, does that not leave us in something of a sad state when it comes to other issues in personal life? What sort of things we like to eat, our sleeping habits, our sexual preferences? But unlike advocates who claim that maternal instincts naturally push one towards attachment parenting, it's not the case that we must act on this low-level reasoning. Indeed, we have the power not to act in this way, and that is, of course, what Descartes said makes us human. But nor is it the case, as Vogel might suggest, that this low-level reasoning is a separate and irrelevant part of a higher-minded process. So, just to conclude, the accountability strategies women employ in narrating their full-term breastfeeding work in a symbiotic way to create a vision of motherhood legitimated by natural bases. It's not simply the case then that these women are doing what is scientifically best. There is a complex relationship between what feels right to them and what science or evolution tells them is the right thing. But that attachment parenting, as just one form of a more intensive parenting culture, aims to bring about stronger social ties can seem a little ironic at times. Ironic because this ethos can pit groups or tribes of women against each other, those that do it right, those that do it wrong. And this climate has created a situation where it's harder and harder for people to turn to each other in the general business of raising children. Instead, the group that does it right is pushed further inward, away from society, identifying others out there, not as partners in a shared endeavour of community building, but as victims in need of education. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte, for that rich description of breastfeeding. We're going to move on now to Kiki and formula feeding.
Thank you. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Jenny, wherever you are, for inviting me to speak here today. Hello. So I'm going to talk to you about a paper which was published last year in Maternal and Child Nutrition, which examined the emotional and practical experiences of formula feeding mothers. And the concept for the study really came off the back of some qualitative data that I collected during my PhD, which examined maternal feeding practices. And a particularly interesting theme came out of the data that puts the study that I'm talking about today into context quite nicely. So the theme concerned a group of women who had particularly strong intentions to breastfeed in pregnancy, initiated breastfeeding in accordance with current guidelines, yet for various reasons weren't able to continue exclusively breastfeeding for the recommended 6 months. So these women appear to have particularly pronounced negative emotional and practical experiences surrounding their supplementation or complete switch to formula. And I've just provided a couple of quotes here which really highlight this. So the first lady, Miss H at the top, discusses the process of grief surrounding breastfeeding cessation and talked really quite emotively during the interview about feelings of failure and guilt. Miss B at the bottom discusses hiding SMA from her friends in fear of judgment, and that's despite them knowing the struggles that she'd experienced breastfeeding. So this got us thinking about how common this emotional and practical burden might be for formula feeding mothers, and whether that burden is greater for formula feeding mothers who intended to exclusively breastfeed in pregnancy or initiated exclusive breastfeeding in accordance with current guidelines. So we had a look at the the literature, and we found the predominance of infant feeding research actually focuses on identifying mothers' reasons for the cessation of breastfeeding. Now, while this is important in informing breastfeeding interventions, the experience of mothers who use formula in a context where breastfeeding is strongly advocated has been somewhat overlooked. Now, given that 88% of mothers are using some quantity of formula in the first 6 months, there's only 23 studies in this area, which compared to the breastfeeding literature is really tiny. And there's a systematic review which synthesises all of the evidence in this area quite nicely. So there's 6 qualitative studies, and these all focus on emotional experiences. So we've got themes of guilt, stigma and dissatisfaction highlighted across all of these studies. And as in my qualitative research, some of these feelings appear to be more pronounced when formula feeding wasn't intended in pregnancy. Now, the focus of the quantitative studies is more around the practical experiences of these mothers. So these studies report a perceived lack of support and information from health professionals and a perceived reluctance by health professionals to provide feeding advice. So no study had explored these emotional and practical factors simultaneously, nor quantified them in a large formula feeding sample. So the aims of our study were to firstly describe the emotional and practical experiences of mothers who use formula in any quantity. We then wanted to examine whether these experiences varied among cohorts of formula feeding mums. And finally, we wanted to examine whether these experiences varied according to feeding intention in pregnancy. So we had 3 key aims. So we used a cross-sectional survey designed to address our aims. For the exposure variables, mothers were asked to provide a binary yes/no response to indicate the presence of feelings of guilt, stigma and defence as a result of their infant feeding choices. Perceived levels of satisfaction, respect and support were then ascertained by a 5-point Likert scale. And finally, we asked about their main source of infant feeding information. Our outcomes were current feeding type and prenatal feeding intention. So I'm just going to briefly run through the abbreviations because I use them throughout the results section. So in current feeding type, EBF, now EFF, stands for those who initiated exclusive breastfeeding in accordance with current guidelines, yet were exclusively formula feeding at the time of study. EFF stands for exclusively formula feeding from birth, and Combi relates to all types of combination feeding. In the feeding intention results, IEBF stands for intention to exclusively breastfeed, IEFF stands for intention to exclusively formula feed, and ICombi again relates to all types of combination feeding mums. So we recruited 601 mums to take part. These mums were all had infants between 0 and 6 months. And the age of the final sample ranged between 18 to 46 years with a mean age of 29. The baby's age ranged from 1 to 26 weeks with a mean of 18 weeks. And the sample were mostly married primates based in the UK. 56% of the mothers intended to exclusively breastfeed, which is comparable with UK breastfeeding data. And 46% of the sample initiated exclusive breastfeeding but were exclusively formula feeding at the time of study. So just to provide the descriptive experiences of the overall sample. So we can see from this graph the data follows the same kind of pattern, and the majority of the mums indicated that they experienced negative emotional experiences as a result of the way that they chose to feed the baby. So around 70% of all of the mothers indicated that they'd experienced guilt, stigma and defence as a result of using formula. Despite that, the majority of mothers responded that they felt respected and satisfied with their feeding method. But when we look at support, only 36% of the sample felt well supported by health professionals. So this left the majority of mums experiencing low to moderate levels of support. And this was echoed really in the descriptive statistics regarding infant feeding information. The internet was favoured above health professionals here as a source of infant feeding information, with 31% of mums choosing this option. and mothers were almost equally likely to gain information from health professionals as they were to go and find information of their own accord. So the second aim of the study was to examine whether these experiences varied according to feeding type. And I'm just going to report some of the key findings here. So in terms of emotional experience, our regressions reveal that those who initiated exclusive breastfeeding but were formula feeding exclusively at the time of study had 4 times the risk of experiencing guilt in relation to those who exclusively formula fed from birth, and twice the risk of experiencing guilt when compared to those who combination fed. Again, those who initiated exclusive breastfeeding but were formula feeding at the time of study had 3 times the risk of experiencing dissatisfaction with their feeding method when compared to those who exclusively formula fed from birth. Conversely, those who exclusively formula fed from birth had twice the risk of experiencing stigma when compared to the other cohorts. Finally, we wanted to examine whether the experiences varied according to feeding intention in pregnancy. And you'll see here that the data actually revealed exactly the same type of pattern that it did for feeding type, only the results were much stronger, the associations were much stronger when we analysed according to feeding intention in pregnancy. So we found that formula feeding mothers who intended to exclusively breastfeed in pregnancy had over 8 times the risk of experiencing guilt when compared to those who intended to exclusively formula feed, and twice the risk in relation to mothers who plan to combination feed. Mothers who plan to exclusively breastfeed were remarkably at 14 times the risk of dissatisfaction with their feeding method when compared to those who plan to exclusively formula feed from birth, and 4 times the risk when compared to those who plan to combination feed. Again, the same pattern. Those mothers who plan to exclusively formula feed from birth were at twice the risk of experiencing stigma than those who plan to exclusively breastfeed or combination feed. So exactly the same pattern for feeding type and feeding intention, only the data was much stronger in terms of feeding intention. So I'm just going to discuss the findings now. So you can see in terms of our overall sample, a high percentage of mothers experienced negative emotions, including guilt, stigma and defence, as a result of their choice to use formula. So this is the first study to provide numerical data to support a large amount of qualitative research and quantify the highly pervasive nature of negative emotions occurring among these cohorts. So we know that 88% of mums are using formula in the first 6 months of life. These findings indicate a widespread public health issue that requires attention. We know negative emotions are common in women of childbearing age anyway, and they're a precursor to more serious postnatal mood issues and potentially detrimental maternal or infant health outcomes. Negative emotions relating to infant feeding can exacerbate these relationships further. In terms of the data relating to the overall sample in terms of support and information, we revealed that the majority of the mothers in this study felt unsupported by health professionals and were more likely to rely on the internet for infant feeding information than to seek advice from them. So this might occur as a result of not conforming to health professionals' recommendations, or stem from a perception that health professionals judge formula to be an inferior option. In either case, an under-reliance on infant feeding support and information from health services can result in errors in the preparation, handling and storage of milk, which can have, again, really poor implications for infant health. Moving on to discuss the associations by feeding type and intention. So we found that those that intended to follow recommendations or initiated exclusive breastfeeding in accordance with current recommendations were at a significantly higher risk of dissatisfaction and guilt. These associations remain strong after adjustment for a range of confounders as well. These findings really highlight the moralistic nature of the current pro-breastfeeding discourse and highlight the emotional costs for those who try but aren't able to achieve the current recommendation of exclusive breastfeeding to 6 months. There's lots of other work out there that's also suggested that this is an unachievable one-size-fits-all approach which doesn't take into account in individual circumstances. Finally, as we saw, our associations for dissatisfaction and guilt were much stronger when we looked at it in terms of feeding intention than when we looked at it in terms of feeding type. So this suggests that the negative emotions experienced when prenatal exclusive breastfeeding expectations are unmet may actually be more profound than those experienced when exclusive breastfeeding is ceased postnatally. Another really interesting finding was that those who intended to exclusively formula feed from birth or initiated formula feeding from birth were at a much higher risk of experiencing stigma. So this suggests that mothers who intentionally choose to use formula might be prone to a distinct yet still negative emotional experience. Furthermore, these mothers were also more likely to rely on family members than health professionals for infant feeding information when compared to those who attempted to follow current breastfeeding recommendations. So it's argued that our current promotional strategies might serve to alienate those who intend to formula feed and create reluctance among this cohort to seek professional advice about infant feeding. Just to conclude really, the evidence presented here suggests that the current approach to infant feeding promotion and support may be paradoxically related to significant issues with emotional state. The evidence also suggests that specific emotional burdens for these cohorts dependent on feeding type postnatally and feeding intention in pregnancy. So while initiatives such as Baby Friendly are critically important in developing countries or high-risk situations, they may need to be situationally adapted in higher income countries such as the UK. This isn't an isolated finding and it points to tensions with current promotional efforts in their current form. We know that our exclusive breastfeeding rates are low, less than 1% at 6 months currently, and they continue to stagnate. This has been the case since the first infant feeding survey in 1990, nothing's changed. There's very little out there that examines the effectiveness of public health interventions that are created to increase rates of breastfeeding initiation and duration in higher income countries such as the UK. As Charlotte said, the data tends to be global and then applied specifically to the UK, whereas the UK has a unique infant feeding landscape. There's only 2 studies that have been conducted in the UK in baby-friendly environments, and both of these indicate that the advantages of the current strategy are transient and not sustained. There's an urgent need for further evaluation of BFI in higher income countries such as the UK. There's now stability amongst both the qualitative and quantitative literature in the field, and these findings could provide a really good basis to inform large-scale trials and evaluations which examine the effectiveness of current promotional strategies. Ultimately, we need to think about whether the advantages of the current infant feeding promotion outweigh the apparent risk to maternal emotional state. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions at the end, yeah, thank you. So our last speaker for the day, I'd like to welcome Fiona to the podium.
Can people hear me? There is a handout. There are spare copies of the handout at the front, and also available if anybody doesn't have one. And I can give you one of mine. It's just taking its time. Yes, this is strategic. Is it? It is open. we go, hooray! I just like to add in a bit of excitement at the end of the day. Is there going to be a talk? Is there not going to be a talk? Okay, so I work in the philosophy of pregnancy, birth and early motherhood, and what I see as my job is basically picking out philosophical mistakes in the way that we think about pregnancy, birth and early motherhood, and showing how these contribute to harm to women, basically. The kind of atmosphere that we've heard a lot about today. The mistake or the philosophical issue that I want to look at is the distinction between harm and benefit and how this applies to infant feeding decisions. So you'll all be familiar with the phrase breast is best, and that phrase is controversial for many reasons. But one perhaps surprising criticism comes from breastfeeding advocates. So the objective of breastfeeding advocates is that talking about the benefits of breastfeeding is a mistake because it represents breastfeeding as a departure from the norm, when in fact breastfeeding should be treated as the default for infant feeding. So I think that those who want to support breastfeeding do have an interest in representing breastfeeding as the default. For example, to counteract criticism of public breastfeeding and to argue for support of breastfeeding. I want to connect that issue, that criticism, to an increasing trend for advice to new mothers to warn that formula feeding harms babies instead of stating that breastfeeding is beneficial. And so what I'm going to argue is that this distinction matters. So the harm-benefit distinction is generally morally significant, and this means that holding those who decide to use formula harm their babies is likely to contribute to guilt associated with formula feeding and thus to undermine the well-being of vulnerable women. However, I think that the harm-benefit distinction doesn't apply easily to infant feeding decisions, in part because of difficulties in determining whether we should treat breastfeeding as the default for infant feeding. So what I'm going to show is that neither the descriptive facts of the matter nor moral considerations provides an easy answer. So this is supposed to be a response to people who say, well, people talk about benefits of breastfeeding, but we all know it's really the risks of formula feeding. And I think that you can't know that because that isn't true. And definitely not simply true. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that you hear from breastfeeding advocates when they're objecting to breast is best. They say things like, breast milk is the bog standard normal substance a human infant is built to consume. There's nothing best or superior about it. Or they say, breastfeeding is the biological norm, the way that humans have evolved to feed their children. Breast is not best, it's normal. Now, as Diane Wessinger points out, classifying breastfeeding as normal or standard can have important implications for how we think about formula feeding. She says, the truth is, breastfeeding is nothing more than normal. Artificial feeding, which is neither the same nor superior, is therefore deficient, incomplete, and inferior. Those are difficult words, but they have an appropriate place in our vocabulary. So she's embracing the idea that we should reject breast as best, see breastfeeding as the default, and therefore conclude that formula feeding is inferior, deficient. So on this model, holding that breastfeeding is normal might lead us to see formula feeding as harmful. And we might classify a woman who decides to use formula as harming her child. And this is in fact what you see in some recent breastfeeding promotion. So for example, there are a pair of adverts from the National Breastfeeding Campaign in the US which showed pregnant women taking part in a log rolling competition or riding a mechanical bull, followed by the slogan, "You wouldn't take risks before your baby's born, why start after?" So that the thought there is, it's not that breastfeeding is beneficial. Clearly, if you formula feed, you're taking risks with your baby in the same way as you would be if you decided to go in a mechanical bull while you're pregnant. So whether we talk in terms of risks of formula rather than benefits of breastfeeding, and whether we frame formula as feeding as harming rather than simply not benefiting, is important because these distinctions are morally significant. So there are much stronger constraints against harming than merely allowing harm, preventing a benefit, or failing to bestow a benefit. So, for example, harming might require much stronger justification if it's going to be permissible on grounds of avoidance cost to the agent or on grounds of the greater good. In addition, harming leads to much stronger reactive attitudes if it is unjustified. Sorry, lost my place. Basically, if you harm somebody and it's an unjustifiable harm, then you're going to get much more blame and guilt than if you just allow somebody to harm, and that was also unjustified. And an agent who has harmed or is likely to harm is also liable for much greater interference, either as punishment or prevention. So this means that if we frame formula feeding as harming, especially if we at the same time hold that the difference in incomes is significant, then we imply that women who formula feed without extremely strong justification are liable for blame, guilt, and possibly external interference to prevent or punish their behaviour. So to illustrate this, I'm in a Facebook conversation, is a polite way to put it at the moment, with somebody who's basically saying, we should treat formula feeding just like we treat smoking cigarettes. We should make women feel guilty because it'd be good if they felt guilty, because this would make them more likely to breastfeed their babies. And the idea there is that the guilt, that the bad experiences of the mothers just don't matter, because it's okay to make somebody feel bad if you're stopping them from harming somebody else. So this discounting of the effects of aggressive breastfeeding promotion on formula, on those who are formula feeding, is linked in to this idea that formula feeding involves harming the child, because it's only if you think that they're doing something wrong that you could possibly think it's okay to make them feel guilty. But what's the actual answer? So many people say, this isn't us making a moral judgment. Look, breastfeeding is the biological norm, so it's harming people. So Diane Messenger again says, breastfeeding is the default because health comparisons use a biological, not a cultural norm, where whether the deviation is helpful or harmful. So she says smokers have higher rates of illness, increasing prenatal folic acid may reduce fetal defects, and because breastfeeding is the biological norm, breastfeeding babies are not healthier, artificially fed babies are ill more often and more seriously, breastfed babies do not smell better, artificial feeding results in an abnormal and unpleasant odour that reflects problems in the infant's gut. So according to that way of thinking, it just follows from science that if outcomes are better for breastfed babies, formula feeding counts as harming or risking harm. But I don't think it does follow from the science that that's the right way to talk about it. I think this way of looking presented ignores the fact that breastfeeding requires the mother's body and agency. Breastfeeding is doing something. Now, I tried to make this point at another workshop, and there were cries of horror. What about the breast crawl? The breast crawl, if anyone doesn't know, is where you, after birth, the baby crawls from wherever it's fallen, goes straight to the boob, and latches on, and then rainbows. The breast crawl does sometimes happen, and it's very cool when it happens. But even accepting that, you still have to probably put the baby on the mother's stomach, or at least the mother has to kind of put herself in an appropriate position for the baby to get to the boob. And after the first feed, so after you've left the birthing bed, the mother has to lift the baby out of the cot, or she has to have carried the baby around with her so that it's always close enough to feed. Babies die if their mothers fall into comas and there aren't other people to look after them, even if the mother's breasts are still functioning. Right? You have a lactating unconscious woman and a baby, you're going to have a dead baby, right? You need to do things in order to breastfeed your baby. Now, one common way to work out whether an agent has harmed somebody in philosophy is to look at whether the victim would have been better off if the agent had done nothing, if the agent had been unconscious. So on this account, both formula feeding and breastfeeding count as benefiting, because the default, what would have happened if the mother had done nothing, is the baby starving to death. But this account doesn't seem to work very well in the context of infant feeding, because it seems to classify feeding your baby rat poison as benefiting them, so long as the results are better than starvation. Because if the mother had done nothing, the baby would have starved, so if the results are anything better than starvation, yay! It's a benefit! That doesn't seem right. Now, one way that you might try to show that rat poison is harmful to babies is by pointing to the mechanism of harm. Sorry, you can tell I'm a philosopher because we actually consider how can we show that feeding your baby rat poison does count as harming. So I don't know a lot about rat poison or biology, but I presume that rat poison contains actively harmful ingredients. So ingesting rat poison isn't just actively missing, it's not just missing out on something, it's receiving something that is actively harmful. So if we follow that train of thought, we might think the key question in working out whether formula feeding is harmful or merely not beneficial is whether formula contains actively harmful ingredients or just doesn't contain some cool stuff that breast milk does. Now, I agree, this is going to be important and relevant, and we should be looking at this. And I think that if formula feeding doesn't contain actively harmful ingredients, it quite straightforwardly shouldn't be classified as harming. But even if formula feeding does contain some harmful ingredients, then it still might not be appropriate to classify formula feeding as harming. Because in the rat poison case, there's an accessible alternative that doesn't involve the mother's agency that's better. So someone else could feed her baby formula or breast milk. In the formula versus breast milk case, there might not be such an accessible alternative. The options might be either she breastfeeds her baby, or she gives it formula, or it starves. So there isn't a sort of better alternative which doesn't require the use of the mother's body and agency. So my conclusion is, that shouldn't be on that slide yet. Right. that the idea of the default and the related notion of harm and risk versus benefit just don't apply easily to infant feeding decisions. These ideas are basically made for your paradigm idea of human agency, which is probably a man and another man, and they can kind of get on all right if they don't interfere with each other, but they're not kind of connected, they're separate. That's where these ideas of harm and benefit come from. So if you try and apply them to the context of infant feeding decisions, where you have one being that's really dependent on another, then they're not going to work so well. So fixing on the biological norm ignores the role of the mother's agency in breastfeeding. Treating the default as doing nothing implies that any non-fatal food benefits, and looking at the internal mechanisms is relevant but not decisive. So the descriptive facts of the matter don't provide an easy answer here. Is there decisive pragmatic or moral reason to favour one way of talking? I think here again we're going to be pulled in two different directions. Breastfeeding mothers and breastfeeding supporters have reason to want to emphasise breastfeeding as the default. And that's not just to kind of look down on formula feeders, it's to fight back against the stigma of public breastfeeding, it's to argue for support of breastfeeding even in non-ideal situations. So Helen Calvert has a very nice article on the effect of breast is best rhetoric on the support for breastfeeding on the children's ward. So basically, breast is seen as best, an optional extra, so it was hard for her to get provisions in order to be able to breastfeed on the children's ward. They might need to encourage mothers who have failed by insufficient support to become sufficiently angry. So formula feeders, and those who care about them, have reason to resist characterization of breastfeeding as the default, where this in turn unjustly portrays formula feeders as harming their babies, adding to the already substantial guilt and shame that can accompany formula feeding. And of course, we shouldn't be misled by these characterizations into thinking this is a simple case of the interest of one group of mothers, formula feeders, versus the interest of a completely separate group, breastfeeders. One and the same mother may both use formula and breastfeed, either at the same time or at different times. So one and the same mother might require support for breastfeeding and protection against guilt and shame for using formula. So what's the solution? I think we need to reject the assumption that there has to be a default, one default for infant feeding. We need to be able to say that breastfeeding is normal and natural and should not be stigmatized or seen as a lifestyle choice that can only be accommodated under ideal circumstances. But we need to make that happen in a way that doesn't imply breastfeeding as the default in a sense that implies that formula feeding is a deviation that harms your baby.